On a cracked and sun-scorched ranch at the edge of Dry Hollow, a widowed woman gave a dying stranger a sip of water and unknowingly rewrote her fate. What began as a quiet act of compassion would stir whispers in town, awaken buried secrets, and draw the thunder of hooves to her doorstep. But who was the wounded man with eyes full of silence? And why did his presence make the earth itself feel like it was holding its breath? The land gave no mercy that summer. It cracked under the weight of sun and sorrow, refusing even weeds the chance to bloom. Hannah Moore had spent the morning fighting with a splintered fence post, a task made heavier by the knowledge that the well was nearly dry. Her husband James had once done this work before the fever took him last winter, before the town buried him without ceremony and resumed pretending Hannah never belonged. They called her the widow out west, a woman too young to grieve and too proud to remarry. She lived alone on the edge of Dry Hollow past the mesquite trees where only the stubborn or the broken clung to land. Most days Hannah wasn't sure which she was, but that day something changed. As she hauled a dented bucket toward the barn, Hannah caught a glimpse of something odd near the ridge behind her property. At first she thought it was a bundle of discarded cloth left by drifters, but when she climbed the slope for a closer look, her steps faltered. It wasn't a blanket. It was a man. He lay curled on his side, half conscious. Blood stained the dry ground beneath him, seeping through his torn deerskin shirt. A raw gash on his shoulder had dried to rust. His feet were bare. Around his neck hung a string of beads and feathers. Apache Hannah's breath hitched. Old warnings echoed from her childhood stories of raids, stolen cattle, and worse. The women at church had whispered about men like him, their voices tight with fear and something colder. She stepped back, but then he moved, not with aggression, not even awareness. Just a low groan of pain, as if even dying now required effort. His eyes barely fluttered open, wild and dark, like smoke after lightning. He tried to lift his head and failed. And that was the moment she stopped moving. No one would help him. The town wouldn't care. In fact, if they found him here, they'd blame her. But Hannah couldn't turn away. Not from the way his ribs rose like broken fence slats. Not from the way dust clung to his cracked lips. She turned on her heel, ran to the barn, and returned minutes later with the last of the well water. Precious nearly gone, she knelt, lifted his head gently, and pressed the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, wordlessly. She had no idea who he was, only that something old had shifted the moment he looked at her and drank. Hannah didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the windmill, every groan of the old boards in her bedroom floor she imagined as footsteps, either from the town coming to accuse her or from the man she'd given water to rising with revenge in his veins. When the first hints of dawn painted the sky in dusty orange, she heard it, not imagination this time, thunder, but not from the sky, from the earth. She stumbled out of bed and onto the porch in her nightdress, heart thudding. The sound was unmistakable now. Hooves, dozens of them. The ground vibrated beneath her feet. Through the low morning light, silhouettes formed. Riders so many that for a moment her breath refused to move. They came in silence, their formation tight and sure. Horses moved like ghosts, hooves barely disturbing the dust. No war cries, no shouting, only the terrifying calm of men who didn't need noise to be heard. She gripped the empty rifle her husband had left behind. It wasn't loaded. She didn't know how to load it, but it felt better than bare hands. They encircled her ranch in seconds. Warriors in full paint, feathers catching the wind, faces solemn, not cruel but sharp with meaning. She counted at least 20, maybe more. And at the head of them, riding stiffly but upright, was the man from the ridge. He was still pale, a bandage now visible on his shoulder, tied with one of her old dish rags. He dismounted slowly. His eyes never left hers. No one moved. The warriors waited. He limped forward, not with menace but purpose. She stood frozen on the porch, unsure whether to speak, to run, or to pray. Then he stopped just a few feet away. He raised his arms slowly, palm open. A signal. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried just one word she gave. Then he turned to the others and spoke in Apache words. She didn't understand, but the weight of them sank into the morning air like stones in water, and the reaction was immediate. Weapons lowered, shoulders eased. A few men nodded. One even offered a slight bow of the head toward her. Then, as swiftly as they had arrived, the riders turned and began to retreat, disappearing into the desert like a dream evaporating in sunlight. All except him. He stayed. Without another word, he limped past her toward the barn and sank into the shade beside the trough, like it was his place, like it had always been. He didn't look at her again. Hannah stood on the porch, rifle clutched to her chest, heart pounding. The town would never believe it. They'd call her a fool, a traitor. But the silence left in the rider's wake wasn't threatening. It was something else, something heavy, respect maybe, or something older. And whatever it was, it had chosen to stay. By the time the dust from the riders had settled, the ranch was silent again. The wounded man remained by the barn, his back resting against the post, eyes closed. He didn't speak, didn't ask for more water, didn't ask for shelter, and Hannah, rifle still in hand, didn't know whether to demand he leave or ask him to stay. But something about his presence settled her more than it scared her. The town would never understand. To them, he was a savage. To her, he was a question she didn't yet have an answer for. Later that morning, Hannah tried to mend the fence post again, the one she'd wrestled the day before, but her arms were tired, her mind scattered. She cursed under her breath when the hammer slipped, nicking her knuckle. She turned toward the barn to grab a rag and froze. He was already there. Wordless, he stepped forward, took the hammer from her hand gently, and knelt beside the post. He worked quietly, efficiently, the way her husband James used to, except this time she wasn't waiting to be told to stand back. She watched in silence. His shoulder was still wrapped and dark blood stained the edge of the fabric. Every motion looked like it hurt, and yet he didn't stop. "You shouldn't be lifting anything," she said finally. He didn't look at her. "You gave," he said simply. "I return." That was all over. The next 2 days, the rhythm of the ranch began to change. She still slept in the house. He stayed outside near the barn or under the mesquite. But each morning he rose early, fed the chickens, collected firewood, checked the well. He didn't ask what needed doing. He simply saw it. When she cooked, she brought out 2 plates. He never ate before she took the first bite. When she fetched water, he always carried the heavier bucket. He moved like someone who had been forgotten by the world but still remembered how to carry it. And slowly Hannah stopped questioning why she allowed it. They didn't talk much. She didn't know his name, he didn't know hers, but something unspoken passed between them, more solid than language, trust maybe, or duty, or perhaps just 2 souls too tired to keep their walls up any longer. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky to gold, he sat sharpening a blade outside the barn. Hannah stood on the porch, arms folded. "They think I'm mad for letting you stay," she said. He didn't stop sharpening. "They think I'm sleeping with you." He paused, lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Words are smoke," he said. She almost laughed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll run out of town." He nodded slowly. "You gave water to a dying man. That is not shame. That is root," she blinked. "Root in my people," he said. "A woman who gives water gives life, not just to body, to spirit." And with that, he turned back to his blade. And Hannah, for the first time in years, felt seen. The wind that night carried more than dust. It carried a warning. Hannah felt it in her bones before she heard the noise, a creak of wood, a shuffle of boots outside. Then a scream. She bolted upright. Flames licked the dry straw near the chicken coop. Feathers flew in a wild panic as the fire spread fast. Lanterns swung in the dark, revealing masked figures. 4 men's faces, shadowed intent. Clear. One carried a rope, another held a branding iron, its tip glowing red. The third held a rifle. The fourth, standing back with arms crossed, was Brody. Of course it was Brody. He had wanted her land ever since James died, hovering with his smirks and his concerns. Now he wasn't asking, he was taking. "I warned you, Hannah," he shouted over the crackle of fire. "Harboring savages comes with a price." She grabbed the rifle by the door, still unloaded, still useless, but clutched it like a lifeline. As she stepped out onto the porch, hard hammering, the barn doors burst open. Takakota didn't run. He walked deliberate, unflinching. The torchlight glinted off the blade in his hand. The first man lunged. He didn't get far. In a blur of movement, Takakota twisted the branding iron from his grip and sent him sprawling into the dirt. Another man raised his weapon too slow. Takakota ducked, swept his legs, and knocked the breath from his chest. The third swung a fist. Takakota took it with a grunt, then responded with one strike that dropped the man like a sack of stone. Only Brody remained. "You think you can scare me?" he barked, raising his pistol. Takakota didn't speak. He stepped forward. Hannah, shaking but furious, walked beside him and leveled her empty rifle straight at Brody's chest. "Try it," she said through clenched teeth. "See what happens." Brody's smirk faltered. "You wouldn't shoot. I don't have to," she replied, her voice cold. "He already spared you once." Takakota didn't move. but his silence thundered. Brody spat at the ground and turned. "This isn't over, you're right," Hannah said. "It's just beginning." By dawn the fire was out, the ground soaked with ash. The chickens that survived clucked quietly in corners of the yard. Takakota sat on the steps, his knuckles bloodied, breathing hard. Hannah wrapped his hands in cloth with gentle fingers, neither of them speaking, but something had shifted. Not just in the night in her. He hadn't run. Neither had she. For the first time since James died, she wasn't hiding behind grief or survival. She was standing in front of something and someone that mattered. As the sun rose, streaking the sky in muted gold, Hannah realized the ranch was no longer just a place she protected. It was a place worth protecting. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone anymore. The silence after the fire felt heavier than the smoke had ever been. Dry Hollow didn't speak Hannah's name aloud anymore, but she felt their judgment in the narrowed eyes, the cold stares, the quiet doors that closed when she passed, and still Takakota stayed. Not because she asked, and certainly not because it was easy, but because something unspoken had taken root between them. Fragile yet unyielding, he rebuilt what had been burned. The chicken coop first, then the fence line where blood had once soaked into the earth. He worked as if the land owed him nothing, yet he gave it everything. Hannah found herself moving with him in quiet rhythm. Two people navigating a world that had left scars on both their bodies and hearts. They didn't talk about Brody, or the men who came with torches, or the way the townsfolk had stood by and watched. Instead, they lived between the silences, meals shared without words, firewood stacked side by side, glances. That carried weight no language could hold. The bond between them wasn't forged by desire. It was something older, more sacred, trust. But the calm didn't mean peace. One morning, while Hannah was mending an old chest in the loft, she found it a letter folded in brittle parchment, tucked between rotting beams. Her heart sank as her eyes scanned the ink. It was from James. Her late husband. To Mr. Brody it began. "I accept the terms of sale. Please ensure my wife is told only when necessary." Her hands trembled. The date was weeks before James died. He had planned to sell the ranch behind her back to Brody. Of all people, the betrayal knocked the wind from her chest, everything she had fought to preserve. James had meant to give away, and not just the land, her dignity, her voice. Takakota found her moments later pale and shaking. He read the letter, his expression unreadable. Then with a calm that chilled her more than any anger, he folded it neatly and said, "Now you know what he wanted." She looked at him, tears brimming. "And what do I do with it?" He met her gaze with quiet certainty. "You do what he never let you. You choose." That night, Hannah didn't sleep. She sat on the porch watching the sky, the letter clenched in her hand. She thought of Brody's threats, of the town's whispers, of the fire, the silence, the scars. And by morning, she had made her choice. She would ride into town, not to ask permission, not to play, but to reclaim what was always hers. The days grew hotter, but a strange calm settled over the ranch. Dry Hollow had gone quiet, too quiet. No more torches, no more threats. Just the heavy hush of a town waiting for something to break. Takakota stayed. He worked the land beside Hannah like it belonged to them both, mending fences, repairing tools, sharpening knives. He still never asked for anything and never crossed the line between them. Yet his presence was constant, as steady as the windmill or the sunburnt earth. And Hannah began to breathe easier with him near. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out the loft of the old barn, she found it, an envelope cracked, yellowed, tucked inside the corner of an old chest that once belonged to James. Her late husband's name was scrawled on the front in his familiar, rigid handwriting. She opened it with care, her fingers trembling. To Mr. Brody it began. "I accept your offer. Once my wife is informed, I expect discretion until the sale is finalized. She's not ready to let go, but I am." It was dated 3 weeks before James died. She read it again and again. Each time the words cut deeper. He was going to sell the ranch behind her back to Brody. The same man who had nearly burned it to the ground. The same man who claimed to be helping her even as he circled like a buzzard. She dropped the letter. Breath knocked from her lungs. The barn spun around her. The sound of boots on the floor pulled her back. Takakota stood in the doorway, eyes scanning her face. He didn't ask what was wrong, just waited. Hannah held the letter out to him with a shaking hand. "He was going to sell this place," she whispered, "to Brody, and never even tell me." Takakota took the page gently, his fingers brushing hers. He read it once, face unreadable. "You still have the land," he said. For now, she choked. "But if Brody has a copy, if he shows up with a judge," her voice cracked. I thought James loved this place. I thought he loved me. Takakota folded the letter slowly and precisely, then placed it on the workbench beside them. He loved control, he said, quiet but firm. Not land, not you. The truth landed like a stone, heavy, hard, but also freeing. She met his gaze and for the first time saw her marriage for what it had been, a cage built with good manners and unspoken rules. That evening, as the sky blushed orange and the wind turned restless, Hannah saddled her horse. She didn't ask Takakota to follow. She didn't tell him where she was going. She just rode straight into town, into the courthouse, and placed the letter on the judge's desk with both hands. No one else will fight for this land, she said, so I will. The next morning, Hannah rose before the sun. She hadn't slept. Not really. Her dreams were loud with echoes of fire, of Brody's voice, of James's betrayal, pressed between paper and dust. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the promise of heat. Takakota was already in the barn, tightening saddles with quiet focus. He looked up as she stepped in, dressed in her best, a dark blue riding skirt and the white blouse she hadn't worn since James's funeral. Her hair was pinned neatly, stubborn strands tucked behind her ears. I'm going, she said. He gave a slight nod. Not alone, they rode out together side by side, past the blackened fence, past the coop that still bore burn marks, past the ghosts of last week's violence. Neither spoke, but both knew this wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about claiming a voice that had been silenced too long. Dry Hollow's town square was already gathering when they arrived. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, the preacher. Even Sheriff Maddox, flanked by his two deputies, and Brody standing smug in front of the courthouse steps, arms folded, his men lingering just close enough to threaten. Hannah dismounted and handed her reins to Takakota. Then she walked, no hesitation, right up to Judge Leland. The judge, a large man with tired eyes and tobacco-stained fingers, glanced at the papers in his hand. I read your letter, he said. Legally, your husband never completed the sale. There's no deed transfer, no record filed with the county. Brody stepped forward, red-faced. We had an agreement, you had a conversation, the judge corrected, and you tried to enforce it with fire and threats. The crowd murmured. Brody's jaw tightened. She's lying. Look at who she brought. He pointed toward Takakota. You expect us to believe anything she says when she's shacking up with Hannah? Cut him off, that's enough. She stepped between Brody and the judge, raising her voice for the first time in weeks. You broke into my land, you threatened me, you burned my property, all because you thought no one would stop you. Brody laughed bitterly. You think this crowd is going to save you? No, she said, her voice steady. But I don't need saving. Behind her, Takakota stepped forward, calm, silent. Brody's hand twitched toward his hip. In an instant, Takakota moved faster than breath, one strike. Brody's pistol clattered to the dirt. The crowd gasped. Sheriff Maddox raised a hand but didn't move. Takakota said nothing, just stood between Hannah and the man who had haunted her for months. Judge Leland cleared his throat. Miss Moore owns that land. That's the law. And if I hear another whisper of threats or trespassing, you'll answer to me. Brody snarled but said nothing more. That day, for the first time, Dry Hollow saw her not just as James's widow or the strange woman on the edge of town, but as a force. And beside her stood a man who said little, but had already spoken volume. After that day in the square, everything shifted. Not overnight, Dry Hollow didn't change that fast, but the weight around Hannah's shoulders began to lift. Slowly, grudgingly, the town stopped looking at her like a warning and started seeing her as something else, unshakable. The sheriff stopped by a week later, not with questions or warnings, but with a quiet nod and a message the council had voted not to pursue anything further. No charges, he said, adjusting his hat. No more talk either. She nodded, not out of gratitude but acknowledgement. They weren't offering peace, just stepping aside. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to heal. The chickens laid again. The well held strong. The barn, patched and reinforced, stood taller than before. But more than the land, it was the silence between her and Takakota that changed. It softened, deepened. He still worked before dawn, still slept in the barn, unless storms rolled in. But now he sat closer at dinner, asked questions, answered more. One evening, as the sky turned to fire behind the hills, Hannah brought him something. A carved wooden hawk he'd once given her, now strung on a string of leather. For you, she said, placing it in his palm. A reminder that you're not alone. He turned it over carefully. His thumb brushed the beaded eye. Thank you. They stood together in the orange light, hands brushing, not holding, yet somehow connected all the same. Later that night, she returned to the old chest in the loft. the same one that had held the letter from James. She pulled out a faded journal blank after the first page. She opened it, dipped her pen, and began to write. Not just about James or Brody or what had been stolen, but about the things she had almost forgotten. The sound of hooves before dawn, the look in Takakota's eyes when he worked in silence, the small kindnesses no one else had ever bothered with. She wrote of the day she offered water to a dying man and how somehow he brought her back to life. As the moon rose high and silver, Takakota stood beside the well, his eyes on the stars, his hands clasped behind his back. She joined him, her steps quiet but purposeful. "This is where it began," he said just above a whisper. She nodded. "And it's where I'll stay," he turned. "Not alone." She looked at him, at the man no one had dared trust, the man she trusted more than anyone, and smiled. Not anymore. The wind shifted. Not harsh like before, but soft, like something exhaling. The land, the house, even the air seemed to rest. Sometimes the smallest acts hold the greatest weight. A cup of water. A place to rest. A name remembered when the world forgets, and sometimes, against all odds, what begins in dust and fire ends in peace. Sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with a quiet act of humanity. A woman gave a dying man water, not knowing it would change the course of both their lives. In a world scarred by division and distrust, Hannah and Takakota chose compassion. And in doing so, they built something rare, trust rooted in silence, nurtured by fire and held together by truth. Their story reminds us that even in the harshest lands, love can take root, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to stay,